Chapter 2, Rascal. June. June was the month. School was out, cherries were ripe, and all the boys and some of the girls went barefoot. Boys had many extra advantages, such as swimming naked and wandering alone along the streams and rivers, casting for bass among the water lilies. Girls had to wear swimming suits and come in earlier from our evening games of Prisoner's Base and Run Sheep Run. I was very thankful that I was a boy. Despite mowing lawns and working in my war garden, I had many additional hours to spend with my pets, watching my woodchucks nibbling clover, feeding my 4 yearling skunks, their bread and milk, and trying to keep Po the Crow from stealing bright objects such as car keys. Most satisfying of all were the hours that I spent with my small raccoon, who I named Rascal. Perhaps a psychologist might say that I had substituted pets for a family. I had a human family, of course, interesting, well-educated, and affectionate. But Mother was dead, my father often away on business trips, my brother Herschel fighting in France, and my sisters Theo and Jessica now living their adult lives. Both sisters had taken tender care of me after Mother died, Jessica in particular postponing her career in marriage. But now Theo was happily wed to a young paper mill owner in northern Minnesota, and Jessica, a talented linguist and poet, was taking postgraduate work at the University of Chicago. Often the only occupant of our 10-room house was an 11-year-old boy working on his canoe in the living room and thinking long, long thoughts. One problem that puzzled me was theological. I asked myself how God could be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-merciful, and still allow so much suffering in the world. In particular, how could he have taken my gifted and gentle mother when she was only 47 years old? I asked some of these questions of Reverend Hooton, the Methodist minister whose church and parsonage adjoined our property, and his answers were not particularly satisfying. It seemed to me unfair that she could not have lived to see the pets I was raising, Rascal especially. I could imagine her pleasure, both as a biologist and a mother. She would have been interested in studying more closely the habits of all these animals, and would have helped me solve some of the difficult problems they presented. For instance, both my crow and my skunks were currently in trouble with the Methodists. Po the Crow lived in the belfry of the church and shouted the only phrase he knew, "What fun, what fun," as distinguished parishioners came to church services, weddings, and funerals. There was one faction of the church in favor of evicting Po with a shotgun if necessary. My harmless skunks had further complicated matters on a recent Sunday evening. These pleasant pets that I had dug from a hole the previous spring were now more than a year old and somewhat restless. They were handsome, glossy creatures, one broad stripe, one narrow stripe, one short stripe, and one black beauty with a single star of white on his head. All 4 had perfect manners. Having never been frightened or abused, they had never scented up the neighborhood. But one night, in June, when Wowzer must have been drowsing, a stray dog came barking and snarling at them through the woven wire, and they reacted predictably. Sunday services were progressing at the church not 70 feet from their cage. It was a warm evening, and the windows of the choir loft were open. For the first time in his life, Reverend Hooton shortened his sermon. On Monday morning, a delegation of deacons came to protest to my father. With both Po and the skunks at issue, I was in double jeopardy, so I decided to make an accommodation. I gave all my skunks a last meal of bread and milk, and took them in 2 carrying baskets to Wentworth's woods, where there were many empty dens to hide in. The Methodists were so pleased to be rid of the skunks that they decided to postpone indefinitely the eviction of Po the Crow. Rascal, meantime, was living in a hole some 5 feet above the ground in our big red oak tree. Since raccoons usually stay in their nest for the first 2 months of their lives, I saw little of my pet, except when I took him out to feed him. I soon taught him how to drink his warm milk from a saucer, which was a great improvement over the laborious process of letting him nurse through a wheat straw. Wowzer was his guardian, remaining almost constantly at the foot of the oak tree, even sleeping there at night. But on an afternoon in mid-June, Wowzer and I were both alerted by a quivering trill at the hole in the tree, and there we saw a small black mask and 2 beady eyes pointing out at the wide world beyond. A moment later, Rascal had executed an about-face and was emerging from the hole. ringtail first, backing down the tree cautiously in the manner of a little bear. Raccoons have 5 unretractable claws on each of their hands and feet, making headlong descent inadvisable. So Rascal instinctively came down tail first, scrambling frantically from time to time and often looking over his shoulder to see how far he was from the ground. Wowzer was very much disturbed and yelped a few questions, looking up to see how I felt about this new problem. I told my St. Bernard not to worry, just to wait and watch. Rascal must have been surveying the backyard very thoroughly from his front door, for he started immediately for my shallow, cemented bait pond, always alive with minnows. The edges of this pool slanted gradually toward the deeper central portion, making it convenient for my amazingly confident little raccoon. Without a moment's hesitation, he waded in and began feeling all over the bottom, his sensitive, prehensile fingers telling him all that he needed to know about this minnow pond. Meanwhile, his eyes seemed to focus on the far horizon, as though eyes and hands were in no way connected. Shiners and chubs dashed frantically for safety, sometimes leaping clear of the water in their attempt to escape. As Rascal methodically circled the pool on his first fishing expedition, I marveled that one so young and with no mother to teach him knew precisely the technique used by all other raccoons for catching minnows. I watched fascinated to see if some ancient wisdom stored within his brain would make his search successful. My answer came a moment later when those 2 clever little black hands seized a 4-inch shiner. Then the washing ceremony began. Although the minnow was perfectly clean, Rascal sloshed it back and forth for several minutes before retiring to dry land to enjoy his meal, more delicious because he had caught this fish himself. Seemingly satisfied with the one minnow, and aware he could catch more any time he wished, Rascal began a leisurely tour of the backyard, sniffing and feeling. There were interesting odors to be classified, odors of cat, dog, woodchuck, and recently evicted skunk. There were crickets in the grass worthy of a pounce, and the chilling shadow of Poe the Crow, which for a passing moment froze Rascal in his tracks as a meadow mouse will freeze in the shadow of a hawk. When Rascal came too near to any of our property lines, Wowzer went into action, nudging him back toward the tree. Rascal responded mildly to this discipline, and after another 15 minutes examining his domain, this small lord of the manor returned to his castle, climbed the tree more easily than he had descended, and disappeared into his hole. I decided one day that Rascal was clean enough and bright enough to eat with us at the table. I went to the attic and brought down the family high chair, last used during my own infancy. Next morning, while my father was fixing eggs, toast, and coffee, I went out to get Rascal and placed him in the high chair beside me at the table. On his tray, I put a heavy earthenware bowl of warm milk. Rascal could reach the milk easily by standing in the chair and placing his hands on the edge of the tray. He seemed to like the new arrangement and chirred and trilled his satisfaction. Except for dribbling a little milk, easily wiped from the tray of the high chair, his table manners proved excellent, much better than those of most children. My father was amused and permissive as usual, and even petted the raccoon as we finished our meal. Breakfast for 3 became part of the daily ritual, and we had no trouble whatsoever until I had the idea of offering Rascal a sugar loaf. It is true we were at war, observing heatless, meatless, and wheatless days and conserving sugar. But my father and I did no baking and used almost none of our sugar ration, save for a lump or 2 in coffee, so I did not feel too unpatriotic when I gave Rascal his first sugar. Rascal felt it, sniffed it, and then began his usual washing ceremony, swishing it back and forth through his bowl of milk. In a few moments, of course, it melted entirely away, and a more surprised little coon you have never seen in your life. He felt all over the bottom of the bowl to see if he had dropped it, then turned over his right hand to assure himself it was empty, then examined his left hand in the same manner. Finally, he looked at me and trilled a shrill question. Who had stolen his sugar lump? Recovering from my laughter, I gave him a second sugar lump, which Rascal examined minutely. He started to wash it, but hesitated. A very shrewd look came into his bright black eyes, and instead of washing away a second treat, he took it directly to his mouth, where he began to munch it with complete satisfaction. When Rascal had learned a lesson, he had learned it for life. Never again did he wash a lump of sugar. His intelligence, however, created many problems. For instance, He had seen the source of the sugar, the covered bowl in the middle of the table. And whereas I had previously been able to confine him to his high chair, he now insisted upon walking across the tablecloth, lifting the lid of the sugar bowl, and helping himself to a lump. From that day on, we had to keep the sugar bowl in the corner cupboard to avoid having a small raccoon constantly on the dining room table. Another lesson he learned swiftly was how to open the back screen door. I purposely had not repaired the catch or replaced the weakened spring because all my cats liked to open the door and walk in or push it from inside and let themselves out again. Rascal watched this performance several times. Obviously, the trick was to hook your claws into the screen and pull. Feeling very pleased with himself, he showed the cats he was as smart as the oldest and wisest Tom. Several nights later, I was startled and delighted to hear Rascal's trill from the pillow beside me, then to feel his little hands working all over my face. My raccoon baby had climbed from his hole, opened the back screen door, and with eyes that could see in the dark, had found his way to my bed. There were no strict rules in our house, as both Rascal and I realized. My raccoon had decided that the best place to sleep was with me. He was as clean as any cat, housebroken immediately and without training, and he thought my bed was softer and more comfortable than his own in the oak tree. So from that night on, we became bedfellows, and for many months we slept together. I felt less lonesome now when my father was away. Cable stories in the Janesville Daily Gazette admitted that the Germans had reached the banks of the Marne and were within sight of the Eiffel Tower. On the big war map in the window of the Tobacco Exchange Bank, the black-headed pins representing the German lines were in several places, pushing back the red, white, and blue pins, which indicated varied Allied sectors. Somewhere in that storm of lead and steel, my brother Herschel was fighting. Among my favorite poems at this time were Rupert Brooke's War Sonnets and Alan Seeger's prophetic and gallant lament, I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. Particularly on nights of thunder and lightning, I had nightmares about the war and pulled the covers over our heads. But when the sun arose the next morning to shine on the rain-wet grass, Rascal and I forgot our fears and prepared to go fishing. One of my favorite fishing spots was a sandbar below the Indian Ford Dam and Rock River, a stream which rises in the Horicon marshes of Wisconsin and enters the Mississippi at Rock Island, Illinois. There were deep holes and rapids, marshy bayous, and stretches as quiet as a lake, a beautiful and unpredictable stream. On a previous evening, I had searched the wet lawn with a flashlight to catch more than 50 night crawlers. My jointed steel rod was strapped under the bar of my bicycle, and my tackle box with reel and line and lures was ready to place in the bicycle basket on the handlebars. It was good that my box was small and compact, leaving room for my fishing companion, who in the last few days had become a cycling maniac. Rascal was a demon for speed. Weighing 2 pounds at most, this absurd and lovable little creature had the heart of a lion. He had learned to stand in the closely woven wire basket with his feet wide apart and his hands firmly gripping the front rim, his small button of a nose pointed straight into the wind, and his ringtail streaming back like the plume of a hunting dog that had come to point. The most amusing aspect of his racing costume was his natural black goggles around his bright eyes, making him look like Barney Oldfield coming down the home stretch. What he liked the best was going full tilt down a steep hill. It worried him slightly when I had to work hard, pumping up the next hill, the front wheel woggling from side to side to keep the bicycle in balance. But as we picked up speed again, his confidence returned, and he would peer ahead like the engineer leaning from the cab window of old 99. On the southern edge of town, we had to pass the cemetery where my mother was buried under a white stone that said, in memory of Sarah Elizabeth Nelson North, 1866 to 1914. It seemed an inadequate tribute, only partially compensated by the roses I had planted there. From the cemetery it was all downhill to Indian Ford, with a fine view of the winding river bordered by woods and pastures and neat geometric fields of corn, tobacco, wheat, and oats. In these years of war prosperity, the barns were newly painted a cheerful red and the farmhouses white amid wide lawns and flowers. We gained speed in these last 2 miles, and Rascal came to full attention, the wind sweeping into his face and blowing his whiskers back to his furry ears. We were probably as happy as anyone can be in our world. This was the first time Rascal had seen Indian Ford, and there were many exciting things to show him. The bridge with girders rising 20 feet above the water from which boys dared each other to dive. The dam itself with a shining sheet of water cascading into the depths below. The powerhouse from which emerged the continuous purring of the dynamos. And finally, the swift tail race, too dangerous for any swimmer, particularly for a small raccoon who had barely learned to dog paddle. We turned down river on a path skirted by willows in which the red-winged blackbirds made the day still more liquid with their conqueree, conqueree. And upon a bank overlooking a bend in the big stream, we found wild strawberries almost as bright as the red epaulets on the wings of the blackbirds. A single taste of these berries, and Rascal waded into the patch, snatching and devouring. For one so eager and so curious, each moment brought new delights. We came at last to my secret fishing place, the sandbar with the deep and quiet hole below it, where I had caught more fish than anywhere else in the river. I left my bicycle in the willows and began assembling my jointed pole and reel, running my silk line through the agate eyes and tip, and tying to that line a short gut leader, a swivel, and a red and white bass plug. Rascal needed no such elaborate preparation. His fishing equipment was always ready for immediate use. You might say he was born with more fishing sense and fishing tackle than most human beings acquire in a lifetime. I watched him for several minutes as he worked his way along the upper edge of the sandbar, examining every inch of the shallows with a slight treading or pumping motion which alternated the pressure and progress of his two hands. His eyes, as usual, played no part in this intimate investigation of his fishing grounds, as his gaze ranged far across the river to the opposite shore. At the outermost point of the bar, he was momentarily swept into the stream, and I was preparing to rush to his rescue. But with no apparent distress, he swam back to the quiet water below the bar and began examining this lower margin of the small peninsula. With the whole river inviting their escape, the minnows were too swift for Rascal's hands, but he soon encountered and grasped a little monster of which he had no previous knowledge. His catch was a particularly large crayfish, or crawdad in the terminology of the region. This freshwater lobster has claws that can pinch severely, an armored body, and a delicious tail. A feast I had often enjoyed consisted of perhaps 25 such crayfish tails boiled over a campfire. Pink, firm, and tasting like shrimp, they furnished an excellent appetizer before the entree of fried catfish or mulligan stew. This, however, was Rascal's first crayfish. Had he been informed by his mother, he would have grasped it just behind the claws, thus avoiding any danger from those waving, sawtooth pincers. But having no one to teach him, he missed the safe and sane grasp and was pinched several times before he crushed the head with his needle-sharp teeth, washed his prey, and turned the crayfish around to gobble up the delectable tail. Once pinched, twice shy, the very next crayfish he caught was handled with the professional skill of an old and wise raccoon. Feeling certain that Rascal was in no danger from the river or from its smaller inhabitants, I began my own fishing. I was barefoot, of course, with my overalls rolled high above my knees. So I waded into the cool water at the tip of the point, pleasurably expectant as I prepared for my first cast. Below the point was cupped the deep, dark pool, edged toward the shore with small pond lilies, water lilies, and slender flowers, which we called arrowheads. I cast smoothly toward the hiding place of many a bass and pickerel, reeling in the plug with pauses to allow any game fish that might be following to strike the lure. Once a bass struck and missed, but refused to strike again. A few minutes later, a sunfish weighing perhaps a pound followed the red and white wobbler almost to the end of the pole, then turned in a flash of color and was gone. A dozen more casts produced no additional results, so I reeled in to change my rig for catfish, those big, fighting, fork-tailed silver cats that furnished more sport than any other fish in the river. Anglers who have never taken this particular mutation of channel catfish find it hard to believe that these fish will strike almost any lure, a bucktail fly, a live minnow or frog, and, of course, chicken livers and night crawlers. These trim, slim, and beautiful fish are streamlined for action and will frequently fight for 20 minutes or half an hour before being brought to the net. As I returned to my tackle box, I saw that Rascal had eaten his fill of crayfish and had decided to take a nap in the willow shade beside my bicycle. This left me free to give full attention to my fishing. I attached a bronze catfish hook to my leader, weighted my line with 4 split buckshot, and strung an appetizing bait of night crawlers on the hook. Once again wading into the water at the point of the sandbar, I cast 100 feet downstream to the deepest part of the pool. I waited for nearly 10 minutes, and then the electrifying moment came. The bait moved twice. The line twitched as the big cat nosed the night crawlers. Then he struck with all his might, the line singing off the reel as I slowed it with my thumb. As I pulled back to set the hook, my pole bent almost double, and the fight was on. He tried all his tricks, once making a long run for the lily pads where he might have tangled the line and broken free, twice making dashes for the faster water where the current could help him. Then, for 3 or 4 minutes, he sulked so deep in the pool I thought he might have gone under a sunken log. He broke water once, all silver and blue, his great forked tail thrashing. Rascal awoke at this point and trundled over to join in the excitement. As the catfish was reeled in nearer and nearer to the shore, the raccoon went up and down the sandbar, glancing at me occasionally to ask questions. "It's a beauty," I told my pet, "one of the best I ever caught." Rascal extended a tentative paw as I brought it into shallow water, but retreated precipitously when the thrashing tail drenched him. Once I had the fish safely on the sand, I slipped my stringer through its gills before I removed the hook. I was taking no last-minute chance of losing this big, shining cat, which by the scale in my tackle box weighed just under 9 pounds. I tied the stringer to a strong willow root, rebaited, and went back to the point, my heart thumping wildly. In 2 hours of fishing, I added nothing more to my string except 3 fat, yellow-bellied bullheads weighing perhaps a pound apiece. However, both Rascal and I went frequently to view again the handsome catfish tethered to the willow. It was approaching noon, and the fish had stopped biting, so I reeled in, removed my tackle, and unjointed my pole. I put the fish in a gunny sack, crowding Rascal a bit in the bicycle basket, and we started homeward up the river trail, filled with contentment. At the Fisherman's Rest at Indian Ford, I bought a bottle of strawberry pop, and Rascal discovered a new delicacy. Without so much as a "by your leave," he put one of his little hands into the bottle, licked off his fingers, and began begging. I waited until I had finished all but the last half-inch of the bottle, then I poured a few drops into Rascal's open and eager mouth. To my amazement, he grasped the neck of the bottle, rolled over on his back, and using both hands and both feet, held it in perfect position while he drained the last sweet drops. Strawberry was his favorite flavor from then on. He never did learn to like lemon sap. Rascal, the second part of Chapter 2, starting on page 39. All raccoons are attracted by shining objects, and Rascal was no exception. He was fascinated by brass doorknobs, glass marbles, my broken Ingersoll watch, and small coins. I gave him 3 bright new pennies, which he hoarded with the happiness of a little miser. He felt them carefully, smelled them, tasted them, and then hid them in a dark corner with some of his other treasures. One day, he decided to carry one of his pennies to the back porch. Po the crow was perched on the porch rail, teasing the cats, but keeping just beyond their reach. This raucous old bird, who cawed and cussed in crow language, was arching his wings and strutting like a pool-room bully as Rascal pushed open the screen and trundled into the sunlight, his penny shining like newly minted gold. Po and Rascal had taken an instant dislike to each other when they first met. Crows, like most other birds, know that raccoons steal birds' eggs and sometimes eat fledglings. In addition, Po was jealous. He had seen me petting and pampering my small raccoon, but Rascal was large enough now to pull a few tail feathers from the big black bird during their noisy squabbles, and Po, who was no fool, was taking few chances. The penny, however, was so tempting that the crow threw caution to the winds and made a dive for the bright object, for crows are as instantly attracted by glittering trinkets as are raccoons, and in addition are inveterate thieves. Rascal was carrying the penny in his mouth, and when Po swooped to conquer, his beak closed not only on the penny but on half a dozen of Rascal's coarse, strong whiskers. When the black thief tried to make his fast getaway, he found himself attached to the raccoon, who, with a high scream of fury, began fighting for his property and his life. Such a tangle of shining black feathers and furious fur you have seldom seen, as Rascal and Po wrestled and struggled. I arrived to untangle them, and both were angry with me. Rascal nipped me slightly for the first time, and Poe made several ungracious comments. The penny, meanwhile, had rolled from the porch into the grass below, where the crow promptly spotted it, seized it once again, and took wing. Straight as a crow flies, seldom applied to my wily pet. After any thievery, he would travel by devious routes before slipping between the wide slats of the Methodist belfry, where he presumably stored his loot. I gave the incident no more thought, pacified Rascal with another penny, and resumed work on my canoe in the living room. The blueprint I had made in the manual training shop at school called for a trim and streamlined craft, 18 feet long and 28 inches wide. The slender longitudinal ribs were fastened at prow and stern and curved around cross-sectional forms between. These and the inner keel were now in place. But the ribs to encircle the craft from gunwale to gunwale presented a problem. I had tried steaming hickory for this purpose and curving the wood under pressure, but had given it up as an impossible job with my limited equipment. Then a happy thought struck me. Nothing is tougher than the water elm used in making cheese boxes. An additional convenience is the fact that these cylinders of thin wood are already curved into a complete circle. Most of the tradesmen were friends of mine. They bought the neatly tied bunches of white-tipped crimson radishes which I raised in my war garden, and gave me meat scraps and stale loaves of bread for Wowzer. I was sure they would give me empty cheese boxes if I asked politely. At Pringle's, they had one good cheese box, and at Wilson's grocery, another. Before I had visited half the food stores in town, I had all I needed. At home in the living room, I marked 2-inch strips on each of these cylinders, and with my father's best ripsaw began the exacting and exasperating job of cutting the featherweight canoe ribs. Some of the boxes split and were ruined, but with patience I finally saw the 42 circles that were required. I found to my great joy that these strips of wood had no tendency to spread, but on the contrary held their circular shape to perfection. All of this work in the living room created some disorder, particularly when I began sandpapering the ribs, starting with number 2 sandpaper and finishing with 00, which is very fine. The wood smoothed to a satin surface, creamy yellow and pleasant to the touch. I was still sanding the ribs, with Rascal clambering over the unfinished canoe, when a Stutz bearcat curved up the gravel drive. Out stepped my beautiful sister, Theodora Maud, the Maud from Tennyson, of course. With her was one of her maids, and Theo had a determined look on her patrician face and a light in her eyes that went well with her mass of auburn hair. "Theo, Theo!" I shouted happily, running out to embrace her. "Well, hello, sonny boy, you're all covered with sawdust." "Well, you see, Theo, I'm building a canoe." "Well, that's nice, but where?" "In the living room," I said, dropping my eyes. "In the living room." "Merciful heavens," Theo said. "Now help Jenny with the baggage and put it in the downstairs bedroom." I didn't dare tell Theo that I was sleeping in that room and that Rascal slept there too. I loved this sister, but I was slightly in awe of her. She had been kind to me after Mother died, and she would be kind to me again some years later when I was stricken by infantile paralysis. But she was a martinet concerning deportment, dress, housekeeping, and much besides. It was her training that made me jump up like a jack-in-the-box whenever an older person, particularly a lady, entered the room. She dressed me on occasion in such fashionable Norfolk suits and jackets that it took several fistfights to prove I was still one of the gang. Theo gave the living room one sweeping glance and raised her hands in horror. "I've never seen such a mess in my life," she said. "I sweep up the sawdust and shavings every evening. Yes, I see them right there in the fireplace. Daddy and I do a good job of batching it," I said. Defensively, "Batching it? That's just the trouble," Theo said severely. "Now you get that canoe out of the living room this minute, Sterling." I had a little of the family's fire, so I replied with a firm and angry refusal. I told Theo that we were living exactly the way we wanted to live, and that I would never wear a Norfolk suit or a necktie again except on Sundays. "You're not too big to spank," Theo said, her lovely eyes flashing. "You just try." "Now, Sterling, I've brought Jenny to clean this house from top to bottom. I'll cook some decent food, we'll hire a full-time housekeeper, and we'll get this canoe out of the living room." "Can't you just leave us alone?" I said mournfully. "Anyway, you're not my mother." "Oh, sonny boy," she said, suddenly contrite. Oh, sonny boy," she said, suddenly contrite, and fighting back the tears. She came around the end of the canoe and kissed me quite tenderly. Giving Theo the downstairs bedroom didn't worry me. She always took the big room with its adjoining bath. She said none of the other beds was fit to sleep in. My difficulty would come in trying to explain all this to Rascal. Raccoons have definite patterns in their minds, and Raccoon had decisively chosen the same bed that Theo wanted. He also preferred a room with a bath. Each evening I closed the drain of the big lavatory and left a few inches of water in the basin so that Rascal could get a drink at my time during the night, or perhaps wash a cricket before he ate it. How was I to reveal this to the how was I to reveal to this small creature of habit that he was being evicted? Theo had not seen Rascal until this moment. He had been lying low, watching and listening shrewdly. He may not have been a perfect judge of character, but he reacted with surprising sensitivity to various modulations of voice. He knew when he was being praised or scolded, and when people were feeling affectionate or angry. He didn't altogether trust this auburn-haired stranger, although his eyes strayed often to her shining hair. His virtual invisibility, was due to the fact that he was lying on a large jaguar skin rug which Uncle Justice had sent us from Pará, Brazil. The mounted head had realistic glass eyes, which Rascal often fondled and sometimes tried to dislodge. The little raccoon blended perfectly into the handsomely marked pelt of the once ferocious jungle cat. When Rascal began to rise from that skin, like the disembodied spirit of the Amazonian jaguar, it startled Theo nearly out of her wits. What in the world is that? Well, that's Rascal, my good little raccoon. You mean it lives in the house? Only part of the time. Does it bite? Not unless you slap or scold him. Now get that thing right out of here. Now get that thing right out of here, Sterling. Now get that thing right out of here, Sterling. Well, all right, I agreed reluctantly, knowing that Rascal could let himself back in any time he pleased. Rascal spent the rest of the day sleeping in the oak tree, but that night, when the moon arose, he backed down his tree, padded to the screen door, opened it with ease, and went confidently to our bedroom and crawled in with Theo. My father and I, who were sleeping upstairs, were awakened by a blood-curdling yell. We rushed downstairs in our pajamas to find Theo standing on a chair, treed by a complacent little raccoon who sat on the floor below, blinking up at this crazy human being who was screeching like a fire siren. He always sleeps in this bed, I explained. He's harmless and perfectly clean. You take that horrid little animal out of the house this minute, Theo ordered, and hook the screen door so it can't possibly get back in. Well, okay, I said, but you're sleeping in Rascal's bed, and he has just as many rights around here as you do. Don't be impertinent, Theo said, reassuming her dignity. A later episode of this visit is worth recalling. Recently married, Theo treasured her engagement ring, a square-cut diamond of perhaps 1 carat, mounted in white gold. She had misplaced this ring on several occasions. Once we dug up 85 feet of sewer, only to find that she had transferred the ring to another purse. True to form, she again lost her ring. She thought she had left it on the wide rim of the lavatory when she went to bed, and that either it had fallen into the drain or had been stolen. No one in Brailsford Junction ever locked his door. Not within memory had there been a robbery. We ransacked the house, hunted through the grass and the flower beds, and then made plans for again digging up the sewer. Then a far-fetched possibility struck me like a bolt from the blue. Just before dawn on that fateful morning, I had heard Rascal and Poe having a terrible fight on the back porch. Before I could shake the sleep from my eyes, the cawing and screaming subsided, and I had drowsed off again. Feeling as keen as a Scotland Yard detective, I began to weave a theory. On the 4th night of Theo's visit, I had not hooked the screen door. Rascal had apparently slipped into the house, reached the downstairs bathroom, and wisely chosen not to create another scene. He had decided, however, to have a drink of fresh water from the lavatory, had climbed to the windowsill and then to the basin, and found it empty. But joy of joys, there on the rim of the lavatory was the prettiest object he had ever seen in his life, a big diamond ring gleaming with blue-white radiance in the pre-dawn light. If my theory were sound, Rascal had picked up the ring and taken it to the back porch where Poe the Crow had spotted his treasure. This would explain the crow-raccoon fight which had awakened me. Quite probably the black thief had won again, at least in the matter of flying away with the loot. I had to ask permission of the kindly Reverend Hooton before starting my dusty climb to the 75-foot belfry. The shaft was dark and filled with cobwebs, and some of the cleats were loose, making me fear I might fall. But having enlisted in this venture, there could be no turning back. At long last, I reached the airy little room at the top, with its widely spaced shutters furnishing a view of the town and the creek winding toward the river. I stood for a few moments viewing the world below me. Then I touched the big, deep-toned bell, which had tolled 47 times for my mother, and would one day toll 99 times for my father. Remembering my mission, I began to search the dusty belfry. Behind a pile of discarded hymnals which some dedicated idiot had lugged to this unlikely storage place, I found the ragged circle of twigs and leaves and black feathers which Poe the Crow called home. As some people keep their money in their mattress, Poe had made his bed even more uncomfortable with a pile of shining junk which overran the nest and spilled across the floor. Here were glasses and steelies and one real agate marble, all of which he had stolen during our marble games. Here was my football whistle, snatched while he hovered just over the line of scrimmage, shouting, "What fun, what fun!" Here were scraps of sheet copper, a second key to our Oldsmobile, and, wonder of wonders, Theo's diamond ring. Poe dropped in at about this time, and he didn't say, "What fun!" He wouldn't let me pet him, and he cawed and swore at me as though I were the thief and he the honest householder. I put several of these stolen articles into my pocket. My best marbles, the second key to our car, my football whistle, and Theo's ring, of course. But I left many of the shining trinkets, knowing that Poe couldn't tell sheet copper from a diamond ring. The crow's raucous criticism followed me all the way down that shaft and out into the sunlight. Theo was so pleased with my recovery of her ring that she did not insist on the removal of my canoe from the living room, and she postponed the decision concerning a full-time housekeeper. She merely fed us delightful meals and, with Jenny's help, left the house shining clean, with fresh curtains at the windows. Then, with a goodbye kiss and a wave of her hand, she was off again, gallant and beautiful, brave and temperamental, and now no more.